Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the Protestant Reformation, right? The thing that, of course, that we left off talking about in class was this thing that we were talking about called the German Peasants' Rebellion, or the German Peasants' War, or the Munster Rebellion, as like some other academics refer to it as well. But the thing about it, though, is we left off in class talking about how we are beginning to see some kind of like violence and political tensions and some different like elements pop up during and after the during the Reformation, because we don't really call it after the Reformation until around like 1648, which is actually the end of like this thing called the 30 Years' War that we'll talk about at the very end of this unit. But the big thing, but just to kind of give you something to look forward to or like look towards the end of or whatever. But the big thing about it, though, is we did witness a very large rebellion breakout, right? It was called the German Peasants' Rebellion. Now, what's going to end up happening with this is that it basically, in a nutshell, we talked about it a little bit in class, right? What's going to happen, though, is a bunch of German peasants are going to get really, really upset because their crops are dying, but their rent rates are going up, right? And so they're going to lash out, and they're going to cite some different elements of Scripture saying that basically these German princes are doing them wrong, and they need to actually be kind to their fellow man and follow the ideas of Christ, and that they're going to actually cite these different like pieces of scriptural evidence, and they're also going to write a letter to Martin Luther, and Martin Luther originally represents them and supports them, right? Originally, Martin Luther actually comes out and says, yeah, look at all these ideas they're coming out with. But then what he's going to do is he takes it back, right? Once the violence actually breaks out, once the rebellion itself breaks out, and once like literally large swaths of what is now modern day Germany get taken over by these different like peasant rebellions, or like he's going to then recant this, and he calls them dirty, rotten, disgusting thieves and stuff like that, right? Now, a thing we need to understand about this, though, is why would he do this? A lot of it relates back to those people we were talking about, those German princes, right? Those people that have been keeping him in hiding and will keep him in hiding for the rest of his life, right? He's going to stay in hiding up until the day he dies, and he's going to be hidden and supported by those German princes, right? And in the process of all this, 75,000 people are going to be killed as nobles crush this rebellion. Now, 75,000 is the low estimate. Some historians estimate it as high as 150,000 people died. And like I said, at the Munster church, or outside the church in Munster, Germany, there literally are iron cages like hanging off the side of the church that used to have bodies in them and stuff like that from this peasants' rebellion, which is super gnarly. And like this piece of evidence is just an example of probably some violent and warlike actions to come, right? And we'll keep saying that over and over and over again, all right? In a few slides, I'm going to say it again. In a few slides after that, I'm going to say it again, because it's important to understand that the Reformation is going to lead to some warfare and some large-scale violence, right? Now, the German peasants, though, were seen as radicals, right? These people that break away from different common church ideas, and they break from secular authorities, and these radicals are basically people that are popping up during the Reformation that are demanding a lot or have different, really intense ideas, okay? So radicals include those German peasants, okay, which are going to relate some of their different ideas, and they're actually going to branch off and turn into some different groups of people as well, and some different kind of Protestant religious sects. And this other one that we're about to bring up in about 2 seconds, because the German peasants actually like trace their roots and their ideas closer to Zwingli, right? Teaching the Bible from A to Z, right? Actually trying to separate like civic authorities from church authorities and stuff like that. Now, what we need to understand, though, as well, is radical reformers are really, really important, because you're going to be looking at those German peasants, and then there's another group that is actually considered the main radical Reformation figures, right? And they're these people called the Anabaptists, right? Now, the Anabaptists actually have like a lot of really, really important things about them, and like they have 2 main key ideas. But the interesting thing about them is they're actually going to act like they affected me growing up, right? The Anabaptists, actually, their ideas would eventually actually spread into some other Protestant, like some other Protestant sects, and you're going to see that pop up in the like church that I was raised in as a kid, right? Because the Anabaptists hinge all their ideas on one particular thing: adult baptism, right? So Anabaptists are going to be breaking away from Catholic thought and even some early Lutheran thought early on, because they are saying basically children and babies don't understand faith, and they don't understand what's really going on, so they shouldn't be getting baptized because they can't create a connection with God and stuff like that. So they advocated for people getting baptized as adults, right? As soon as their teenage years are going on into their later adult life, right? And that in baptism without like specific adult consent didn't count, right? And so also the other thing that they came up with as well is that Anabaptists believed in the subordination of the state to their church, as in religious duties always came first, state duties came second, right? And this was really, really big, because this is actually impugning on a lot of that growing monarchical power, right? Like we saw this already in the Renaissance, that monarchs are starting to get stronger. We saw it with the Valois family. We saw it with the Castile family. We saw it with the Habsburg family. We particularly saw it with the Tudor family, which we're going to be talking about them again here in a couple of seconds, right? Now, the thing about it, though, going into it is so by subordination of the church, I mean that these Anabaptists are basically saying, like, our church does not owe the state money, right? They also were saying as well that if a war breaks out, they feel as though if they do not agree with it, they shouldn't have to go, right? And that they shouldn't have to fight in it. This is going to really, really drive some monarchs and some princes and some nobles up a wall, right? Because they're like, what do you mean you won't go die for me? That's ridiculous. Well, the Anabaptists are saying we're not going to do that because as like our religion dictates, we shouldn't have to, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is a mass attempt to snuff out the Anabaptists, right? So what ends up occurring after the Anabaptists pop up during the Reformation is monarchs, princes, and nobles start mass executing the Anabaptists, right? One famous, like, French king actually said, oh, they want to give an adult baptism? I tell you what, I'll give them their third baptism. Basically saying he wanted to drown all of them, right? So going into it, you can actually see as well, like this execution that happened into a Dutch Anabaptist. They actually tied her to a ladder and then threw her onto a bonfire. This one right here actually shows several bodies that have been burned at the stake, and they're all different Anabaptists and stuff like that. So the Anabaptists were actually mass executed, right? Now, they're not going to be completely snuffed out, though. The Anabaptists would eventually transform into some different other groups, right? For example, the Amish, right? We started talking about them a little bit in class because everybody started geeking out about the Amish. But the Amish are actually related to the Anabaptists, and they are actually an offshoot branch of them, right? The Mennonites, the Hutterites are as well, and some Quakers actually even relate the roots of their Protestant faith to the Anabaptists as well. Now, the Anabaptist church never gets so large that it's basically a religious hegemony, like it takes over religious hegemony of an entire country, but it does stay around, right? It's like very, very small, though, okay? Because they were considered so radical, right? That radical reformer, radical Reformation idea of that adult baptism, that subordination to the church, will lead to them having to be very, very tiny, right? Now, Charles V, jumping back over, though, okay, the Anabaptists were also popping up in different areas of the Holy Roman Empire, and what at the time was modern-day Netherlands, right, which at the time was still a part of the Holy Roman Empire. So we need to understand this in essence, okay, is that the Anabaptists are popping up as a part of that group of radical reformers, okay? Now, Charles V, though, is the guy that's in charge of all these areas, y'all. He's the guy that called the Diet of Worms, right? He's the guy that actually is the Holy Roman Emperor at the age of 19. And now, by this point, he's in his early 20s, right? And he decides to call another diet, right? Because he can see all this stuff breaking out. He witnessed the Peasants' Rebellion happen inside of his empire, right? He knows that the Anabaptists are being mass executed in not only parts of his empire, but even in other countries as well, right? So he calls another diet because he sees tumultuous things on the horizon. And what he does at this diet is he wants the Lutherans to come in, and he's basically trying to figure out a way to like placate them and bring them back into the Catholic Church. Well, the Lutherans do not want to do that, right? And at this diet, which I believe is a diet of Speyer, but I'll have to look that up. But at this diet, the Lutherans actually show up with a document, right? And they show up with this thing called the Augsburg Confession. Oh, it's the Diet of Augsburg. It's the Diet of Augsburg. You know, so now like so. Big thing, or the first Diet of Augsburg, right? Now going into it though, they show up with this thing called the Augsburg Confession, right? Now, the Lutherans issue this document, which is basically like a formal outlining of their faith, right? The Augsburg Confession basically explains what Lutherans are, explains what they believe, and explains the concepts of their religion. It was actually co-authored by Martin Luther and several other people that he had at his disposal. And this document will be written in 1530 and showed to Charles V, right? It is still to this day considered the premier statement of faith in the Lutheran Church, right? It was issued in 1530. Well, the thing that's going to end up happening, though, is that Charles V refuses to take this and still demands that they re-enter the Catholic Church. And so what's going to end up occurring is a group will be formed out of this, right? At that diet, at that first diet of Augsburg, there's going to be a group that is formed called the Schmalkaldic League, right? Schmalkaldic League, or the Schmalkaldic League of German Princes, basically is all these different nobles and all these different wealthy individuals from the Holy Roman Empire are going to make a league or a group, right? And that Schmalkaldic League signs a massive document stating that they will not re-enter the Catholic Church and that they will actually instead support the Lutheran Church in its fight against the Catholic, the Catholic hierarchy, as well as the Holy Roman Empire, should it come down to that, right? And look at all these royal symbols and emblems that are actually attached to that document. So it's a very large group of people. Well, the thing about it is Charles V cannot have a bunch of his princes inside of the Holy Roman Empire bucking back against him. So a war breaks out. It's this thing called the Schmalkaldic War, which breaks out in about 1546. It spans most of the southern area of what is now known as Bavaria and Germany, and also goes all the way even into northern Italy, right? Now, the Schmalkaldic War breaks out, though, and what's going to end up happening is that actually Charles V is breaking. Y'all, you have to understand Charles V is like breaking mentally. He is breaking physically. He literally does not want to deal with this anymore. A lot of historians believe that Charles V might have been one of the best leaders that like Europe had ever seen up until this point. But the issue was that he was just kind of screwed from the get-go, right? In the sense that he owned too much land. There was way too much pressure. He also had to try and quell rebellions constantly. And then also on top of that, the Reformation started underneath his reign. So what's going to end up happening at the end of the Schmalkaldic War to cease military operations and wars, Charles issued this thing called the Peace of Augsburg. He calls the Diet again, right? He calls the Diet of Augsburg again. And the thing about it is that the Peace of Augsburg, he finally just throws his hands up and he's like, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. And he's like, I'm not fighting a war against people over religion. I'm not fighting a war against these princes when if they want to do it, they should just do it, right? So the thing about it is he issues this document known as the Peace of Augsburg, right? And the Peace of Augsburg recognized the Lutheran Church as a legitimate church. This enraged the Catholic Church. It enraged the Pope at the time. And they realized that basically everything's kind of fallen apart and that the era of religious hegemony throughout the continent of Europe is done. And we are now entering into a state of pluralism, right? Because of the Peace of Augsburg, I need you to write that down. I need you to write pluralism or religious pluralism throughout Europe, okay? Because the Peace of Augsburg will recognize the Lutherans as legitimate within the Holy Roman Empire and allow German princes to practice their faith. Now, with pluralism, that means that we don't just have a Catholic Church in Western Europe anymore. We now have multiple, right? We now have the Catholic Church, we have the Lutheran Church, and also on the backside, you're going to see this other one pop up here in about 2 seconds, and Calvinists are even going to start shooting up as well. But the Peace of Augsburg recognized the Lutherans as a legitimate church, but there's something that you need to go ahead and write down, okay? And it's this concept inside of the Peace of Augsburg that I need you to, it's very, very important. This is like sticky note material, okay? An addendum of the Peace of Augsburg basically said, whatever religion, okay, the German prince was, his people then had to be that one as well. So if your German prince was Lutheran, the people that lived on his land would be Lutheran, right? If he was Catholic, the people that lived on his land would be Catholic, right? Now, this sets up a little bit of a sketchy situation going into the future, where what if hypothetically one was Lutheran, then he dies, and the one that replaces him is Catholic? Now, what are we to do? But just keep that in the back of your mind, right? The Peace of Augsburg that actually tried to bring an end to this whole thing also did not recognize Calvinism as a legitimate church, just Lutheranism, right? So we were getting into some very, very, very choppy waters. And after this Peace of Augsburg is issued, Charles V abdicated the throne, right? And on top of that, he doesn't just abdicate the throne. He splits his family into two factions now, right? This is a major moment in European history, and it is not talked about at all in the College Board material, which is so stupid because literally it leads to the breakout of not only the 30 Years' War, but also leads to the breakout as well of like different events like the Spanish Armada, the reign of Philip II, his son, and stuff like that in Spain, okay? So you have to understand that this moment of Charles V, whenever after you look at me really quick, right, if you're looking at me right now, he actually does this to his family. Charles V splits his family into two different branches, right? And so the Habsburg family is now not going to be one giant family that spans both Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, also the Netherlands, and also going into Spain and all the colonies. He splits it into two branches where he now has a Spanish branch and an Austrian branch, right? And so the idea behind this was to try and create a more peaceful continent and to try and prevent all of Europe from descending completely into war. Charles V is also, y'all, you have to go and understand, going basically insane. He's an alcoholic by this point. He is really, really struggling with dependency issues. He also is literally snapping and breaking, and he's actually becoming obsessed with his own death because he's getting older. Charles V actually abdicated the throne. He moved into a monastery outside of inside of France, and he went to a monastery just because he knew it would be quiet, right? And he retired there, and he then apparently covered his walls in clocks that all like ticked at the same rate and stuff like that because he was becoming obsessed with like the going away of time. And actually, on top of all of that, one day he had this really wild idea after he abdicated the throne and gave up the Holy Roman Empireship. He literally thought to himself, would anybody care if I died? And so he faked his own funeral and then like wanted to see how many people showed up. And apparently during the middle of his own funeral, Charles V sat up in the casket and stuff like that because he thought people weren't sad enough, and then he like stormed off to his room, which is hilarious, right? So, like, now, but the big thing about it, though, is Charles V abdicates, and he gives these two different branches of the kingdom to two different people. One goes to his brother, all right? The Austrian branch goes to his brother, Ferdinand, and then the other side goes to his son, Philip II, okay? Philip II of Spain is going to be an important figure as we go forward in this Reformation story, okay? But Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V, takes over the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, right? But the thing about it that we need to understand is that the small war that broke out, right, the Schmalkaldic War, is a sign of violence to come, right? Because violence will continue to break out throughout the rest of this era, going all the way over and spanning from about 1530 all the way up to about 1648. So for the next 100 years in Europe, several different wars would break out that are going to be based on religion, right? Now, going into our next one, we need to understand this other guy that popped up during all of this stuff, during all this, okay, at about 1530. So we're now jumping around on our timeline again a little bit. Right around 1530, this other guy popped up that started another sect of Protestantism, right? Basically Martin Luther's counterpart, right? Martin Luther 2.0, right? The software update to Martin Luther. But he's not actually German, he's French, all right? And his name is John Calvin, right? So John Calvin emerges during all of this stuff, during the the tumultuous nature, or during all this like crazy things that's going on during the Reformation. And by the time he becomes active as a reformer, Martin Luther is already almost 20 years deep into his Reformation, right? So just to give kind of like an understanding, by the time that John Calvin starts his end of the Reformation, Martin Luther's already in hiding, right? And because he actually writes a very famous book called The Institutes on Christian Faith and Religion, and he does this in the 1530s, right? Now, to understand his little bit of a backstory, John Calvin is a French citizen, right? So John Calvin is a French man, and he is actually trained as a priest. And the thing about it that's very interesting is that France at the time, and so also during the Reformation, was still staying devoutly Catholic, right? Now, a lot of this actually relates to what we talked about in Unit 1, which is something that you probably don't remember, and it's not completely okay, but there was this guy named Francis I, right? And Francis I was the Valois king of France, who signed that thing called the Concordat of Bologna in 1516, right? And the Concordat of Bologna made it so that he could pick his own bishops, right? But then also, like, the church back in Italy, okay, like the Vatican would be able to tax the French churches and parishes a little bit more efficiently, right? And so they came to an understanding, and that's why France has never gone away from Catholicism completely, right? And though they've still remained a dominantly Catholic church or Catholic country. Now, the thing that does end up happening, though, is that John Calvin sees all this stuff with the Reformation occurring, right? And going into the 1520s, when he's going into his formative years, and he's about 20, in his mid-20s or early 20s. Now, what ends up going down, though, is he begins to actually sympathize and, really, really kind of resonate with a lot of the ideas that a lot of these other, reformers are coming out with. Except that John Calvin and his ideas of what faith should be is he believes that they're not extreme enough. He thinks that they're not intense enough. He thinks they need to be doing more, right? And he says the number one thing we need to do is we need to kind of make it so our church and our government are one and the same, right? He believes that basically the church should run the lives of everyone, right? And so he lashes out against the monarchs of France, and he really, really gets frustrated with the Valois family. So much so that he ends up having to move because there was a death warrant sent out for him, right? His arrest warrant was sent out because he was writing a lot of different pamphlets and writing a lot of different materials, basically saying that the government and the ruling of France should be backed completely by faith, not by a monarchy or any kind of magistrate system or anything like that. And what this does, though, is it ends up basically having an arrest warrant issued for him because Francis I gets really upset with the fact that the idea that a reformation might start in his country, right? Now, the story goes that apparently it's because all these posters popped up. There was this event called the Affair of the Placards, where apparently overnight, France and Paris went from being no posters everywhere to posters everywhere. And the posters said stuff like, oh, condemned to hell the monarchy, and the Catholic Church is bad, and the blah, 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 and all this different really extreme stuff. And then apparently one of those posters even popped up on Francis's bedroom door, right? And so they were like, get John Calvin and kill that guy. So now, and they had already in France, arrested several people that they actually had believed were going to lead to a reformation in France, and were already starting a campaign of executing them as well. So John Calvin, out of fear, moves, and he moves to Switzerland, right? Specifically speaking, Geneva is the city that he moves to. Yay, Cassie, Switzerland. Now, going into it, though, he creates this thing that he believed to be the ultimate Christian community in Geneva, right? Now, in Geneva, Switzerland, he also writes this book called The Institutes of Christian Religion, right? Where he outlines the ideas of a new branch of Christianity called Calvinism, right? And Calvinism, aka after John Calvin, now is going to be very different from even your Lutherans, from even your Zwingli Anabaptists, right? And it's going to be very important that you know who they are, right? So the Calvinists believe in some very, very intense stuff. One, they believe in a God that is absolutely omnipotent, right? The God that they believe in is like the same God that like Lutherans believe in and the Catholics believe in and stuff like that, but they really emphasize the omnipotence of God, right? They believe that God knows what's going to happen to you right now, in the future, before you were born, knows all time, all the time, right? And he also emphasized the fact that humanity is extremely weak, right? And that they are easily led to sin. And so he believed in this concept, and John Calvin believed in this concept, that basically not a lot of people are destined for heaven, right? He believed that there was only a few number of people that are going to be destined to heaven because God knows if you're going to heaven or hell before you're even born, right? And so he referred to those people as the elect, right? And he believed that the elect were the Calvinists themselves, right? He was like, the people that are joining my church and the people that are following the ideas of an omnipotent God who believes in predestination, those are your people who will be elect, right? Now, the thing that you have to understand is that predestination is the key crux of Calvinism, right? That sets it apart from everything else. Because Lutherans and Catholics do believe in concepts of free will, whereas predestination, 86 is that whole concept, right? Predestination is the idea that God knows your ultimate fate before you're even born, right? Before you even done it. He knows your actions. He knows the future. He knows the past. Everything, right? Now, the thing that you have to understand is that is this pessimist or positive? This is a big argument that we will have in class and stuff like that. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Does this actually show itself in other areas of Christianity? We'll discuss that a little bit during our warm-up. But the thing that you also have to understand is that this is going to lead to a community that he starts where a lot of things are not allowed. For example, drinking is not allowed in Calvinist communities. Bright colors are not allowed in Calvinist communities. They have to wear like shades of black, brown, or white, right? They are also not allowed to be showy of their wealth and stuff like that, even if they have wealth, though, right? Which is a very interesting concept. Because Calvinists do believe, jot this down, put some money signs next to Calvinism, Calvinists do believe that hard work is paid off with financial gain, right? Calvinists believe, basically, in essence, that if you were making a lot of money, it means that because God favored you, right? Like, so, yeah, and it's actually, but, like, don't show it off, and don't be a flaunt about it, and things like that, right? They also, like I said, no alcohol, no games, no gambling, no fun, just period, right? Oh, church attendance is absolutely required in Calvinist communities, or else you can be literally beaten in their communities if you don't go to church without a just cause, right? Oh, on Sundays, you're not allowed to play games, even if you're a child, because literally it's something that, like, that is the day of worship, right? Calvinist masses last for hours, right? Now, the interesting thing about it, though, is that nobody, especially in European history, ever just called themselves Calvinist, right? The Calvinism basically became an umbrella term that referred to all these little offshoots of Christians that actually were Calvinists, right? For example, the Puritans are Calvinists, the people you're learning about in Mr. Roddy's class, right? Other Calvinists also include the Huguenots that are going to pop up in France as well. So we need to understand that, right? But this idea was really, really intense, and it actually led to the growth of this thing called the Genevan Consistory, right? And so the Genevan Consistory was basically Calvin's, right, government that ran this city that he had created, right? And so in the Genevan Consistory, they basically had groups of priests that would prosecute people for breaking crimes, right? Or not breaking crimes, for breaking laws and committing crimes, right? They would decide on execution. They would decide on, like, what happened to these people, public beatings or things like that. That's why the stocks is, like, such a big thing, right? Of course, relating back to Calvinism as well. Public embarrassment was a really, really big thing used in Calvinist communities. The Scarlet Letter is a story by Nathaniel Hawthorne that is a part of a Calvinist community, that they wanted to punish this woman with a scarlet A on her chest, referring to adultery, right? So as you can see, like, the Calvinist communities in the Genevan Consistory, which was the law-abiding body in Geneva, that idea is going to continue to spread, and Calvinism is going to spread pretty quickly as well, because literally they're going to start popping up as far away as England, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is that we're going to now stop this flip right here, and we're going to start talking about in class Henry VIII, who in 1521 was known as the Defender of the Faith, right? Because in 1521, Henry VIII wrote a little book called Defending the Seven Sacraments. And basically that book was just lashing out against Martin Luther and the fact that he didn't want to be Catholic anymore. And he was like, how dare you not want to be Catholic? Which is ultimately ironic because a little less than 10 years, like no more than 10 years later, Henry VIII won't be Catholic anymore either. But we'll talk about that when we get back to class, and I'll see y'all soon.